The moment Sarah Harper heard the sound, she already knew something had gone terribly wrong. It was not the crack of a gunshot or the thunder of hooves that stopped her cold in the middle of Redemption Creek's dusty Main Street on that sweltering August afternoon in 1882. It was silence. The kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums and made the hair on the back of your neck rise slow and deliberate, like smoke from a dying fire. The kind of silence that preceded betrayal. She turned, and there they were. Two boys standing in the shadow of the livery stable, no older than 7 and 9, their faces smeared with road dust, and something else she recognized with a hollow ache in her chest. It was the look of children who had learned far too young that the world was a place that did not want them. Their eyes were wide, wild, and wary, fixed on her with the concentrated suspicion of small animals cornered too many times. Every person on that street had walked past them. The blacksmith. The woman in the yellow bonnet who sold dried goods from a cart. The deputy sheriff who had glanced at them, then glanced away with the practiced indifference of a man who had decided that looking too long at someone else's trouble only invited it to become your own. Everyone had kept their distance from the two boys pressed against the livery wall like they were trying to disappear into the weathered wood. Sarah Harper stopped walking. She looked at the boys, and something broke open in her chest with a clean, quiet crack, the way ice breaks over a river in early spring. Not pity. She had no patience for pity. It was recognition, pure and devastating recognition of what it meant to be unwanted in a place that was supposed to be the world. She did not think about what she was doing. She did not calculate the risk or consider the dark rumors she had already heard in the 3 days since arriving in Redemption Creek. She did not think about Aaron Weston's name, spoken in hushed and fearful tones at the boarding house table last night. She did not think about the warnings, the whispered secrets, the forced distance this whole town maintained from anyone connected to that particular name. She simply sat down in the dirt. Right there in the middle of the street, in her traveling dress that had survived 6 days on a stagecoach and was already past saving, she folded herself down into the dust of the Texas Panhandle and looked up at those two boys with level eyes. "My name is Sarah," she said. "What are yours?" The older boy's jaw dropped. The younger one grabbed his brother's sleeve. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, and in that moment the entire invisible architecture of Redemption Creek shifted on its foundation, because what happened next was the beginning of everything. Sarah Harper had arrived in Redemption Creek 3 days prior, on a Tuesday afternoon in August, when the heat rising off the flat Texas plains made the horizon shimmer and lie. She had stepped off the stagecoach with a single trunk, a leather satchel, and the kind of quiet composure that comes not from privilege but from having survived things that would have broken a lesser person. She was 26 years old and had spent the last 8 of those years raising her younger sister in a boarding house in Abilene, after their parents died of typhoid in the winter of 1874. She had cooked and cleaned and taken in mending and taught reading lessons to miners' children for 2 cents a session, and when her sister Clara had married a good man the previous spring and moved to Denver, Sarah had found herself standing in an empty room with the sudden terrifying freedom of a woman who had spent her whole adult life being necessary to someone else. She had answered the advertisement almost on impulse. A town called Redemption Creek in the Texas Panhandle was seeking a school teacher. The letter from the town council had been formal and carefully worded, promising a modest salary, a room above the schoolhouse, and the opportunity to educate the children of a growing frontier community. She had written back the same day. What the letter had not mentioned was the dark past that hung over the town like a thunderhead that never quite broke. She learned about it in pieces, the way you learn most painful things. From Dorothea Marsh, the boarding house owner, who had pressed her lips together thin and said, "You'll want to avoid the Weston Ranch, Miss Harper. That family is not our concern." From the deputy, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had said with peculiar emphasis, "We keep things orderly here. People who respect that are welcome. People who don't tend to find trouble finds them first." From the dry goods merchant, Mr. Alcott, who had dropped his voice to barely above a whisper and said, "The man had a wife. She died 2 years ago. Some say he knows more about how she died than he's told anyone. You understand me." Sarah had understood. She had also noted, with the sharp instinct of a woman who had spent years reading between the lines of what people said and what they meant, that not one of these people had offered her a single fact. Only insinuation. Only the geography of rumor, which always looked more solid from a distance than it proved to be up close. She had filed the warnings away without acting on them, intending simply to do her job, teach the children of Redemption Creek and keep her own affairs orderly. Then she had sat down in the dirt and asked 2 small boys their names. The older boy spoke first. He was 9. She would learn, with Aaron Weston's same dark eyes and a set to his jaw that was already practicing at stubbornness. "I'm Eli," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, the way voices do when you're trying very hard to sound older than you are. "And him?" Sarah nodded at the younger one, who was maybe 7, smaller and lighter boned than his brother, with a smear of dried mud across one cheekbone and the most watchful eyes she had ever seen on a child. "That's Thomas," Eli said. "He doesn't talk much to strangers." "That's all right," Sarah said. She did not stand up. She stayed there in the dirt at eye level with them, which was a deliberate choice and one they seemed to feel because some of the wire tension went out of Thomas's small shoulders. "I'm new here. I'm going to be the school teacher, which means you two are probably going to be in my schoolroom come September." Eli's eyes narrowed. "People don't usually talk to us." "I noticed," Sarah said. "I thought I'd try something different." Thomas, who did not talk much to strangers, chose that moment to step forward half an inch. Just half an inch. But it was the kind of movement that meant everything. She did not realize, sitting there in the dust while the town of Redemption Creek went about its business around her with careful, deliberate ignorance, that she had just walked directly into the center of the storm every single person in this town had been trying to avoid. She did not know yet that Eli and Thomas Weston being in town that day, alone, was itself an anomaly that had the deputy's jaw tight and the boarding house owner's curtains moving. She did not know that the man who had sent them on an errand to the livery stable that morning was standing at the end of the street right now, having returned early, watching her with an expression on his face that was impossible to decipher from any distance. She did not know any of that yet. What she did know was that when Thomas finally opened his mouth and said, in a voice that was barely more than breath, "Are you really going to teach us?" Something locked into place inside her chest that had been loose and uncertain since the moment she had stepped off that stagecoach. "I really am," she said. Aaron Weston had not intended to come into town that day. He had sent Eli and Thomas with old Pedro Martinez, his ranch hand, to collect a saddle from the livery, intending to spend the day mending fence line on the south pasture and staying out of Redemption Creek's way as he had been doing for the better part of 2 years. It was an arrangement that suited everyone. The town did not have to look at him and remember inconvenient questions they could not answer. He did not have to sit beneath the weight of their judgment and pretend it did not crush something in him daily. But Pedro's horse had thrown a shoe 3 miles out, and Aaron had ridden in to find him and had arrived just in time to see a woman he had never laid eyes on in his life sit down deliberately in the street outside the livery and start talking to his sons like they were the most ordinary thing in the world. He stopped his horse. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that men get when physical work and grief strip away everything unnecessary. His face was weathered by sun and wind and the particular erosion of a man who has carried a hidden weight for a long time. He was not by anyone's measure a fearful man. He had driven cattle up from the Rio Grande at 19 and fought claim jumpers at 22, and built his ranch from bare hardpack when everyone told him the land was no good. But watching this woman sit in the dirt and talk to his boys with the kind of natural ease that had been absent from his household for 2 years made something inside him go very quiet and very still, the way the air goes quiet before lightning. He watched Eli's jaw drop. He watched Thomas step forward that half-inch. He rode toward them slowly, because sudden movements startled children who had been through what his children had been through, and he was careful with them always. He came up alongside and looked down from the saddle, and the woman looked up at him without flinching, without the flutter of alarm he was accustomed to seeing in people's faces when they suddenly remembered who he was and adjusted their expressions accordingly. She just looked at him. Brown eyes, level and direct, with a quality of stillness in them that he had not encountered in a very long time. "Mr. Weston," he said, which was a strange thing to say when introducing yourself, but his brain had misfired slightly. "Sarah Harper," she replied, as though they were meeting over a parlor table. "I've just been introduced to your sons. You have very fine boys." The word betrayal was so deeply carved into the landscape of Redemption Creek that it had almost become invisible, like a scar that the surrounding skin has grown over and incorporated. But Aaron Weston knew exactly where it lived and what shape it took. He had been living with it since the night 2 years ago when his wife, Marguerite, had died in a fall from the upper barn loft, and the town had collectively decided that the fall was not quite right and that the man who found her was not quite innocent. It was not something anyone said to his face. Redemption Creek in 1882 operated on the frontier code that kept most grievances in the realm of implication, where they were far more lethal than any direct accusation. No formal charge had ever been brought. No trial had ever occurred. But the verdict had been rendered in the way men stopped meeting his eyes at the saloon, in the way women crossed the street when they saw him coming, in the way his boys came home from town with dust on their knees, and the particular quietness of children who have been made to understand that they are not welcome. What actually happened to Marguerite Weston was this. She had been desperately unhappy for the last year of her life, in a marriage that had gone cold and fractured under the pressure of frontier isolation, and two people who had wanted different things and had been too proud and too exhausted to say so clearly. She had been drinking, quietly and steadily, in the way that desperation sometimes takes when it runs out of other outlets. And on a September night in 1880, she had climbed to the upper loft of the barn for reasons that Aaron had turned over in his mind every single day since and still could not fully answer, and she had fallen. He had found her. He had held her while she died. He had been the only one there, and he had carried her inside, and in the morning he had told his sons that their mother was gone. The dark past that clung to him was not guilt, though it wore guilt's face. It was grief complicated by the knowledge that he had failed her, not with violence or cruelty, but with the quieter failures of a man too locked inside himself to reach toward the person beside him who was drowning. He had not killed Marguerite Weston. But he had not saved her either, and in the mathematics of his own conscience, those two things were not as different as the law might have determined. He had not told this to anyone in Redemption Creek, because no one in Redemption Creek had ever actually asked him. They had simply decided. Sarah Harper, 3 days into her tenure in town, had not yet heard enough of the story to have decided anything. She had heard the insinuation and filed it away as insufficient evidence. What she had seen, sitting in the dirt outside the livery stable, were 2 children who had been made to feel invisible, and that was a kind of injustice she could not walk past without stopping. She would later think that falling in love with Aaron Weston had begun not with any look he gave her or any word he said, but in that moment when he climbed down from his horse, and instead of gathering his boys with the brisk efficiency of a man wanting to remove them from an uncomfortable situation, he had crouched down to their level too and said, "Did you introduce yourselves properly?" And Eli had said yes, and Thomas had nodded, and Aaron had looked at Sarah and said, "Thank you for talking to them." It was such a plain thing to say. Such a very plain and quietly devastated thing, as though thanking a stranger for the basic act of acknowledging his children's existence was something he had learned to be grateful for because it had become rare. She had to look away from his face for a moment because of what she saw in it. The following 2 weeks were an education in the hidden architecture of a small frontier town. Sarah threw herself into preparing the schoolroom, which was a single-room building on the western edge of town with a wood stove, 12 desks, a blackboard that was more gray than black, and a window that faced the flat, enormous Texas sky. She ordered primers and slates and chalk from the supply merchant in Amarillo and wrote lesson plans by lamplight while the September heat slowly, grudgingly began to ease. She also began to learn the town's fault lines by walking them. There were 2 factions in Redemption Creek, though they would never have called themselves that. There were the people aligned with Harlan Briggs, who owned the bank and the largest cattle operation in the county, and who had been Marguerite Weston's uncle by marriage, and who had therefore taken her death as a personal injury that required accounting. And there were the people who were simply afraid of Harlan Briggs and expressed that fear by aligning themselves with whatever position he held most loudly. It was Harlan Briggs who had first begun the quiet campaign against Aaron Weston, not through accusation, but through the more effective weapon of suggestion. A question here, a significant pause there, the raising of an eyebrow at the right moment in the right company. He was a man who understood that in a place where everyone depended on everyone else, controlling the story was more powerful than controlling the law. Sarah learned this from an unexpected source. Bet Caldwell, who ran the laundry and did not subscribe to anyone's politics because she was too busy with everyone's dirty shirts, sat down across from Sarah at the boarding house table one morning and said, with the blunt directness of a woman who had no patience for delicacy, "You've been talking to the Weston boys." "I have," Sarah said. "They're enrolled in the school." "Every child in town is enrolled in the school," Bet said. "That's not what I mean. You went and sat in the dirt and talked to them like regular children, and half this town saw you do it, and Harlan Briggs has heard about it, and he is not a man who enjoys having his arrangements disturbed." Sarah set down her fork. "What kind of arrangements?" Bet looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone making a calculation about trust. Then she said, "Harlan Briggs wants that Weston land. It sits right between his north pasture and the creek. He's been wanting it for 3 years, and he's been waiting for Aaron Weston to either leave or make a mistake he can use. And a new schoolteacher who treats his boys like human beings is the kind of thing that might give Aaron Weston a reason to stay and a reason to fight, and that is not what Harlan Briggs wants." Sarah felt the pieces of it settle into place with the cold clarity of a winter morning. Not a mystery at all, not a dark past, a trap. A slowly constructed, meticulously maintained trap, baited with rumor and social exile, designed to isolate a man until he had no choice but to give up what was his. "Thank you," she said quietly to Bet Caldwell. "Don't thank me," Bet said. "Just be careful, and maybe keep your trunk packed." Sarah did not keep her trunk packed, but she did begin to pay very close attention. The school opened on the first Monday of September 1882, and 12 children arrived, ranging from 5 to 13 years old, trailing mothers who issued last-minute instructions and fathers who stood at a distance with their hats in their hands. Eli Weston arrived on his own with Thomas, both of them clean and pressed in a way that suggested someone had applied significant effort that morning, and Eli was carrying a spelling book that looked brand new. Sarah saw the other children notice the Weston boys arrive. She saw the small social calibrations that children make, which are often crueler in their precision than anything adults manage, because children have not yet learned to disguise them. She saw 2 girls step closer together. She saw a boy named Davis Alcott, the merchant's son, glance toward his mother for direction and receive an almost imperceptible nod that told him everything he needed to know about who in this room to include and who to leave at the margin. She addressed this problem directly, because she had found that indirect approaches to injustice tended to simply give it more room to operate. "We have 12 students in this school," she said, standing at the front of the room, "and we are a class." Not 2 groups or 3 groups. 1 class. The first thing I ask of everyone in this room is that you treat each other with the respect you would want shown to yourself. I will be watching to see that you do, and I am a very thorough watcher." Eli Weston looked at her with an expression that was equal parts surprise and something tentatively approaching hope. Thomas, seated beside him, had his hands flat on his desk and was watching her with those grave, watchful eyes. She taught them reading and arithmetic and penmanship, and the history of Texas, which was complicated and violent and full of injustice and heroism in approximately equal measure. And she taught it honestly, because she thought children deserved honesty more than they deserved comfortable simplifications. By the end of the first week, Davis Alcott had asked Thomas Weston to help him with his numbers, because Thomas had a quiet, precise mind for mathematics that was remarkable in a 7-year-old, and pragmatism often accomplishes what principle cannot. Aaron Weston came to collect his boys on Friday afternoon. He arrived exactly at the closing bell, which told Sarah he had been timing his approach carefully, probably to avoid being in town longer than necessary. He stood outside the schoolroom door, and she watched him through the window for a moment before he saw her watching. He was looking at his sons, who were engaged in the process of packing their slates and arguing in low voices about something with the easy friction of brothers, and the expression on his face was so naked and so full that she had to breathe carefully for a second before she opened the door. "Mr. Weston," she said. "Miss Harper." He pulled his hat off, which was a formal gesture she noticed because he did it with the automatic courtesy of a man who had been raised to it, and had not abandoned it despite everything the world had done to make courtesy seem beside the point. "I wanted to thank you for this week. The boys are excellent students," she said. "Thomas has an extraordinary mind for mathematics." Something moved across Aaron's face too quickly for her to name it. "Marguerite was good with numbers," he said, and then he stopped, and the careful blankness came back over his features like a shade being drawn, and she understood that he had said more than he intended to. She did not pursue it. She filed it, the way she had been filing everything, and she said, "I hope they'll come back Monday. I'd be sorry to lose them." He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sensation again of something being measured, something being weighed with great care. "They'll be here," he said. They would have ended there at professional courtesy if Harlan Briggs had not forced the issue. He came to the schoolhouse on the second Thursday of September, in the middle of the school day, which was a deliberate power display because a man of Harlan Briggs's type always chose the moment that made his target most vulnerable. He was 60 years old, heavy through the chest and neck, with a face that had been handsome once and now wore its authority like a second skin. He knocked on the schoolroom door with 3 sharp raps that silenced the room instantly. Sarah opened it and looked at him without expression. "I've come to speak with the school teacher," he said, as though she were not standing in front of him. "I am the school teacher," Sarah said. "We're in the middle of a lesson. I'm sure your lesson can wait." She looked at him for a second longer than was comfortable, a fraction of silence that established something about how this encounter was going to proceed, and then she said to her class, "Practice your penmanship. I'll be right outside." She stepped through the door and pulled it mostly closed behind her, because she wanted her students to hear that she was not afraid of whoever was on the other side of that door. Harlan Briggs said, with the smooth confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone he respected, "I understand you've taken a particular interest in the Weston children." "I've taken an interest in all my students," Sarah said. "Miss Harper, I'm going to be plain with you. This town has a certain order to it, and that order exists because people have made careful choices about who belongs to this community's life and who stands outside it. Those choices were not made carelessly." "Whose children stand outside the community's life, Mr. Briggs?" He blinked. He had not expected directness. Men of his type rarely did. "The matter of Aaron Weston is one with a complicated history that you are not in a position to understand, having been here less than 3 weeks. "Then perhaps you should explain it to me plainly," Sarah said. because from where I stand, what I see is two children who have been treated as invisible by this town, and I am not able to find a justification for that which satisfies me." The color in Briggs's face shifted. "I would caution you, Miss Harper, that the position of schoolteacher in this town is a matter of contract with the town council, and the town council serves at the community's pleasure, and the community's pleasure is something I have considerable influence over." It was a threat dressed as civic information. Sarah recognized it immediately and felt cold anger move through her with the clean, purposeful quality of water finding its level. "Thank you for making your position clear," she said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Briggs." She went back inside and closed the door and stood for a moment with her back to her students, looking at the blackboard, breathing slowly until the anger settled into something she could use rather than something that used her. "Penmanship," she said, without turning around. "Let me see your progress." She told Aaron about the visit when he came to collect the boys that Friday. She told him plainly and without drama, because she thought he deserved to know what was happening in relation to his sons, and because she was not in the habit of managing other people's information to protect their feelings. She told him what Briggs had said and what she had said back, and she watched his face go through several things rapidly. "You told him to have a good afternoon," Aaron said, and there was something in his voice she had not heard before. It was not quite amusement. It was not quite wonder. It was somewhere between the two, fragile and new. "I did, Miss Harper." He stopped. He looked at the flat horizon for a moment and then back at her, and she saw the thing she had been feeling around the edges of all their conversations suddenly become visible in his face. "Why are you doing this?" "Because it's right," she said. "That's the only reason I need. That's not how it works out here. It's how it works for me." He looked at her with the expression of a man who is encountering something he thought no longer existed and does not quite trust himself to believe in it yet. Then he said quietly, "He's going to make trouble for you." "He's already making trouble for me," Sarah said. "I find I don't particularly care." That was not entirely true. She cared. She had spent a sleepless night after Briggs's visit working through the practical implications of losing this position, which were significant. She had savings enough for 3 months, maybe 4. The nearest town with a school was 40 miles east. She had made a life out of necessity and not out of fear, but necessity was real and fear had its uses, and she was not going to pretend otherwise to herself. She simply was not going to let it determine her choices. What she had not anticipated, making that choice, was how profoundly lonely it would be to make it. She had been in Redemption Creek for 3 weeks and had one genuine friend in Bet Caldwell, whose sympathy was warm but whose self-preservation was also entirely sensible. The other women of the town maintained a careful, polite distance that had nothing to do with dislike and everything to do with the fact that any woman seen spending time with Sarah Harper was now, in Harlan Briggs's invisible ledger, aligned with Aaron Weston. An alignment with Aaron Weston had costs. She sat in her room above the schoolhouse on a Saturday evening in mid-September and wrote a letter to her sister Clara in Denver, describing none of this with any accuracy, but feeling the loneliness of it very precisely. The knock on the schoolhouse door the following Sunday morning was therefore a surprise. She came down the stairs to find Aaron Weston standing on the step with a basket covered in cloth, and a look on his face that suggested he had talked himself in and out of this decision approximately 6 times on the ride from his ranch to town. "Eli and Thomas wanted to bring you something," he said, and then, because they were not there to serve as cover for the gesture, he looked slightly uncomfortable and added, "I may have been the one who suggested it." She looked at the basket and then at him and said, "Would you like to come in?" He sat at the schoolroom's single teacher's desk, which was the only adult-sized furniture in the room, and she brought him the chair from behind it and sat across from him, and they ate the cornbread and preserves that his ranch cook had made and talked for 2 hours, and it was the longest and most honest conversation she had had since arriving in Redemption Creek. He told her about the ranch, which was 640 acres of high, dry Texas grassland that had taken him a decade to build into something viable. He told her about Eli's stubbornness and Thomas's silence, and how both of those qualities sometimes kept him up at night with a worry that had no specific object, only the general terror of raising children alone and being never entirely certain you were doing it correctly. He told her about Pedro Martinez, who was 67 years old and had worked with horses in Chihuahua before crossing into Texas, and who was the only person in Aaron's life who looked at him without calculation. He did not tell her about Marguerite. Not yet. But she felt the shape of that absence in everything he said, the way you feel the presence of a wall you can't see in a dark room. She told him about Abilene. She told him about Clara, and about the years of mending and cooking and managing other people's households to keep a roof overhead, and about the strange grief of having done that so long and so well that, when it ended, she had not known how to be a person whose primary obligation was to herself. She told him she had answered the advertisement for Redemption Creek because it had felt like the kind of place where a person could be useful, and being useful was the only framework for selfhood she had ever really constructed. He listened the way that people who have been genuinely listened to rarely do, which is with his full attention, without preparing his next remark while she was still finishing her sentence. He listened as though what she was saying mattered, and the experience of being listened to like that by that specific man did something to her composure that she was grateful he could not see clearly enough to measure. When he left, he paused in the doorway and said, without looking at her, "I know what they're saying about me. I want you to know I didn't hurt her, but I failed her. That's the truth of it, and it's enough to live with without the other thing on top of it." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I know you didn't hurt her. How do you know that?" He turned to look at her then, and the question was genuine, almost bewildered. "Because of how your boys look at you," she said. "Children who have been hurt know it. They carry it in their bodies. Your boys are wary of the world, but they're not wary of you. They trust you absolutely. That tells me everything I need to know." He stood in the doorway for a long time after that. The Sunday morning light was coming in at a low angle, and it caught the dust motes floating in the schoolroom air, and it lit the side of his face, and she thought, with something between terror and certainty, that she was in serious, serious trouble. "Good morning, Miss Harper," he said finally. "Good morning, Mr. Weston," she replied. October arrived, and the Texas sky went from white-hot to a blue so deep and clear it looked like something you could fall upward into, and the cottonwoods along the creek turned a gold that was almost violent in its intensity. Sarah found a routine: mornings in the schoolroom, afternoons marking work or preparing lessons. Sunday mornings that had, gradually, organically, without any formal arrangement, come to include a visit from Aaron Weston and his sons. Eli had decided he liked her. He expressed this in the way 9-year-old boys express approval of adults, which is by arguing with everything she said and being intensely interested in her responses. He wanted to know about Abilene, about the train she had ridden to get there, about whether she had ever seen a real gunfight, about whether she thought a person could outrun a bullet on a fast horse. She answered every question with complete honesty, which included telling him that no, a person could not outrun a bullet on any horse, fast or otherwise, and watching his face fall with pure scientific disappointment. Thomas had begun talking to her regularly by the 3rd week of school, which Eli reported to his father with the gravity of a significant historical event. Thomas's conversation consisted primarily of mathematical observations about the world. "Miss Harper, if we have 47 cattle and we sell 9, we have 38, and that is a prime number, which means it cannot be divided evenly by anything except itself and 1. Delivered with a seriousness that made her want to laugh and write to every mathematics professor she had ever heard of simultaneously. She was falling in love with all 3 of them, and she knew it, and she was frightened by it in a way that was entirely separate from the fear of Harlan Briggs, because the fear of Briggs was external and finite, and could be managed with courage and clarity. The fear of loving Aaron Weston was internal and bottomless, and could not be managed with anything except honesty. And honesty in this case required a kind of vulnerability she had not practiced in a very long time. Harlan Briggs had not been idle. In the second week of October, Sarah received notice from the town council that her contract was under review due to concerns regarding professional conduct and community relations. The letter was signed by 3 council members, all of whom banked with Harlan Briggs. It was not a termination. It was a warning shot, carefully calibrated, designed to produce a specific result, which was the curtailment of her association with the Weston family. She went to see Bet Caldwell, who read the letter and said, "That son of a bitch," which was the most direct political analysis Sarah had received in Redemption Creek. "What are my options?" Sarah asked. "You could back down. Stop associating with Aaron Weston and his boys and give Briggs what he wants." "No, I didn't think so," Bet said. "Then you need allies. And allies in this town are hard to come by because Briggs controls the bank and half the people here have loans they can't afford to have called in, but not all of them." There were, it turned out, 7 families in Redemption Creek who had children in the school and no particular debt to Harlan Briggs, and a growing appreciation for a schoolteacher who had in 6 weeks transformed a neglected single-room building into a place their children actually wanted to attend. Bet organized them with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been managing logistics her entire life. They came to the next town council meeting, all 7 of them, and they sat in the front rows, and they did not say very much, but their presence said everything, which was that the community's pleasure on the matter of the schoolteacher was not exclusively Harlan Briggs's to define. The contract review was tabled. Briggs left the council meeting with his face carefully composed and his jaw tight, and 2 days later Aaron Weston found 3 of his fence lines cut on the southern boundary, where his property abutted Briggs's north pasture. Sarah heard about the fence from Bet, and that evening she did something she had not done before. She rode out to the Weston ranch. It was 6 miles from town, and she borrowed a gentle brown mare from the livery at a cost she noted carefully in her accounts book, and she rode out in the late afternoon with the sun dropping toward the western horizon and the air carrying the first real edge of autumn cold. The land out here was different from town, wider and quieter, with nothing to interrupt the sky in any direction, and she found it overwhelmingly beautiful in a way that tightened her throat. The ranch was a low-built collection of structures, practical and solid, with a main house of adobe and wood that had been added onto over years in a way that gave it an organic, lived-in quality. There were horses in the corral, and smoke coming from the chimney, and Eli was in the yard splitting kindling with a hand axe under Pedro Martinez's supervision, which was a sight that made her heart catch because 9 was young for that work, but also 9 was old enough. On a working ranch in 1882. Eli saw her first and dropped the axe with a clang and yelled, "Miss Harper," with a volume entirely unnecessary for the distance, and Thomas appeared in the doorway of the main house approximately 2 seconds later, which told her he had been near the window. Aaron came out of the barn. He saw her on horseback, and his face did something she had never seen it do in their months of careful, courteous interaction. His face went completely open for one unguarded moment, all the careful blankness gone, and what was underneath it was so simple and so clear that she felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Then he recovered himself, and the careful consideration came back, and he crossed the yard toward her and said, "Miss Harper, this is unexpected. I heard about the fence lines," she said, and dismounted because she was not going to have this conversation from the back of a horse. He took the mare's reins automatically and looked at her steadily. "It's a ranch matter. It's Harlan Briggs using your land as a weapon because he's angry about a council meeting," she said, "which happened because I went to the council meeting, which means it is, in some sense, also my matter." He held her gaze for a long time. Then he said, "Come inside. I'll make coffee." The ranch house was exactly what she expected from the outside and exactly what she didn't. It was spare and functional, built for work, with the tools of a working ranch life visible everywhere, ropes and harness and the almanac on the table and the gun rack above the door. But there were also books, more books than she had expected, stacked on a shelf beside the fireplace with the comfortable disarray of books that were actually read rather than displayed. And there was a small clay pot on the windowsill with a dried flower in it that had once been yellow and was now the color of old paper, and it was clearly a child's offering, kept because the man living here did not throw away things his children gave him. She sat at the heavy wood table while he made coffee at the cast iron stove, and she noted the care he took in it, the economy of his movements in this kitchen, the particular efficiency of a man who had learned to manage a household because it needed managing and there was no one else to do it. "The fence can be mended," he said, setting the cup in front of her. "It's not the first time." Has he done this before? Smaller things. A missing irrigation pipe. A delivery from the Amarillo suppliers that went mysteriously to the wrong address twice in a row. He sat across from her, and the table between them was close enough that she could see the details of his face that she had been accumulating over weeks without meaning to. The way the lines beside his eyes deepened when he was choosing his words carefully. The small scar on his jaw that she had speculated about. The hands wrapped around the coffee cup, large and work-hardened and, she thought, capable of enormous gentleness. "He wants the land," she said. "He's always wanted the land." Aaron looked down at his cup. "The creek runs through the northern edge of my property. Controls water access for 3 neighboring properties, including his north pasture. Marguerite inherited this land from her father. When she died, Briggs assumed it would revert to her family's estate, which he considers himself the primary heir of." He paused. He was wrong about that. Marguerite changed her will the year before she died. She left everything to the boys. Sarah set down her cup very carefully. "He knows this. He found out about 6 months after she died. That's when things began to change in town." Aaron's voice was even and quiet, the voice of a man recounting facts rather than grievances, but the facts themselves were a kind of devastation. "The campaign against me wasn't grief. It was policy. Make me untenable in this community, make life difficult enough, and either I leave voluntarily, and the land follows the boys to whatever guardian Briggs manages to have appointed, or I make a mistake he can use to have my fitness as a father questioned. Either way, he gets what he wants." Sarah sat with this for a moment. The cold, architectural clarity of it, the deliberateness of using a man's grief and a town's fear as instruments of property acquisition. She had known people who operated this way, had seen it before in the world, but seeing it applied to these specific people, to Aaron and Eli and Thomas, filled her with a clean and focused anger. "He can't have it," she said. Aaron looked at her, and the ghost of that open expression from the yard was back, guarded this time but present. "No," he said, "he can't." They sat in that kitchen for another hour, and Eli came in and demanded to know why she was there, and then decided he was glad she was, and showed her his most recent spelling assignment with the pride of a person presenting an important document. And Thomas came and sat beside her with his slate, and showed her a mathematical proof he had worked out for calculating the area of an irregular field, which was genuinely impressive, and which she told him so with complete sincerity. When she finally rose to leave, the sun was well down and the stars were out in the enormous Texas sky, and Aaron saddled the brown mare for her and walked her to the gate, and they stood there for a moment with the dark pressing in around them and the ranch behind them lit by lamplight from the windows, and neither of them said what was most present in the air between them, because neither of them was ready for that yet. What he said was, "Be careful going back to town." What she said was, "I'll be fine." What both of them were thinking was something neither was prepared to speak aloud yet, but it lived there between them in the dark like something warm and fragile and entirely necessary. November brought the first hard frost and a letter from Harlan Briggs's lawyer to the town council, arguing that the schoolteacher's contract contained a morality clause, and that her regular unchaperoned visits to a widower's ranch constituted a violation of said clause. This was the escalation she had been waiting for, the trap finally fully revealed, and she was not afraid of it because she had been preparing for it since October. She had also, at some point in mid-October, privately and without telling anyone, written a letter to the county seat at Tascosa requesting the legal record of Marguerite Weston's death and the subsequent disposition of her estate. The reply had come back in 3 weeks, and what it contained confirmed everything Aaron had told her and added one detail he had not mentioned, which was that Harlan Briggs had attempted to contest Marguerite's will at the time of probate and had been unsuccessful, and that the presiding judge's notes contained the phrase, insufficient legal standing combined with apparent conflict of financial interest. She brought this document to the council meeting. The room was full. Harlan Briggs was there with his lawyer, a thin man from Amarillo named Cressfield who wore a suit that cost more than most people in the room made in a year. The 7 families who had appeared at the previous meeting were there again, plus 4 more who had been watching developments with increasing unease. Bet Caldwell was there. Deputy Fitch was there, which was interesting, because his presence on any given occasion was always a statement about whose authority he was recognizing. Sarah stood up and read the judge's notes in full. In the clear, carrying voice, she had developed teaching reading to 12 children in a room that required everyone to hear her. She watched Harlan Briggs's face while she read. She watched it go from confident to tight to something colder and more dangerous. She watched his lawyer lean over and whisper something urgent. When she finished, she set the document on the table and said, "The morality clause in my contract refers to conduct unbecoming a schoolteacher. I submit that visiting the family of enrolled students for educational purposes is not unbecoming. I further submit that any member of this council who votes to terminate my contract on these grounds should be prepared to explain that vote to the families of the 11 other students enrolled in this school, all of whom have expressed their satisfaction in writing, which I have here." She produced the second stack of papers. She had spent a week collecting those signatures, going quietly from house to house in the evenings, and every family she had visited had signed without hesitation, and 3 of them had said, in so many words, that they were done being frightened into silence. Harlan Briggs left the meeting without his motion being voted upon. His lawyer gathered the documents from the table and followed him, and the door closed behind them, and the room let out a collective breath that had apparently been held for approximately 2 years. Deputy Fitch said, to no one in particular, "Well." After the meeting, standing outside in the cold November air with frost crackling under their boots, Aaron Weston found her in the crowd. He had been at the back of the room, she knew, because she had seen him come in and had been aware of his presence with every nerve in her body for the duration of the meeting. He had not stood up or spoken, because this had not been his fight to lead and he understood that, but he had been there. He stopped in front of her and he looked at her and he said without preamble, "Sarah." It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it like a key turning. "Aaron," she said, "I need to tell you something." He glanced around at the dispersing crowd, then back at her. "Not here. Walk with me." They walked to the edge of town where the buildings thinned out and the stars were visible above the dark line of the horizon, and they stopped there, and Aaron looked at the sky for a moment and then at her and said, "I have been trying very hard not to say this, because I thought it would complicate your life in ways that weren't fair to ask of you, and because I'm not sure I deserve to say it." "Say it," she said quietly. "I love you." He said it simply and directly, the way he did everything without decoration. "I have been in love with you since you sat down in the dirt in front of my boys and asked their names, and I am aware that this is not a convenient fact, and that I am a man with considerable difficulties attached to him, and I will entirely understand if you—" She stepped forward and put her hand on his arm and he stopped talking. "Aaron," she said, "I sat down in the dirt because I couldn't walk past your sons. I kept sitting down, metaphorically speaking, because of you. Because you are the most decent, most careful, most quietly remarkable person I have encountered in my adult life, and I have been in love with you for approximately 6 weeks and have been struggling with the inconvenience of that fact considerably." He looked at her for a moment that seemed to require its own category of time, and then he took her hand from his arm and held it in both of his, and the warmth of that was extraordinary in the cold November air. "What do we do?" he asked, and the question was so earnest that she loved him more for it than for any other thing he had said. "We do what sensible people do," she said. "We are careful and we are patient, and we let things be what they actually are instead of what is convenient for other people's narratives." He brought her hand up and held it against his chest and looked at her steadily and said, "I have been alone for 2 years. I don't want to be alone anymore." "You're not," she said. "You haven't been, actually, for a while now." He kissed her then, very gently, in the cold dark at the edge of Redemption Creek, with the frost on the ground and the stars overhead, and the distant lamplit windows of the town behind them. And it was not dramatic or complicated, just the simple, absolute rightness of two people who had been moving toward each other through difficulty and distance, and finally arrived. Eli, who it turned out had followed them at a distance because Eli Weston could not let anything involving his father proceed without investigation, appeared from behind a mesquite bush and said, "Are you going to marry Miss Harper?" Aaron, without removing his attention from Sarah, said, "Go home, Eli." "Thomas said you were going to marry her," Eli said. "He said so last month." "Thomas," Sarah said, also without looking away from Aaron, "is an unusually perceptive child." "I told him that," Eli said, with the satisfaction of a person whose intelligence has been retrospectively validated. "I told him he was very perceptive." Aaron turned around and pointed back toward town with the patient authority of a father who has been managing this specific energy for 9 years, and Eli disappeared back toward the lights of town with the trot of someone who had accomplished his mission. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was the kind of winter that tests a place and everyone in it. The cold descended hard in December, harder than the previous years, and 2 early blizzards came off the northern plains and pinned everyone close to their hearths for days at a time. The creek froze in January, which had not happened in 4 years, and 3 ranchers lost cattle to the cold. Aaron and his boys came into town more during that winter than they had in the previous 2 years combined. This was partly practical because the ranch was manageable in extreme cold with enough hands, and Pedro had 2 nephews come out from Amarillo to help, which freed Aaron from constant physical necessity. But it was also, Sarah knew, because he had decided to stop retreating. The campaign that had made him invisible in this town had depended on his cooperation, on his withdrawal, and he had withdrawn because he was a man who processed grief inwardly and who had not realized until recently that in doing so he had ceded ground he should have held. He did not make any grand gestures of reclamation. He simply began to show up, at the general store, at the council meetings, at the church on Sundays, which he had stopped attending 18 months prior, with Eli and Thomas on either side of him. Harlan Briggs was still in Redemption Creek. He would be for a long time to come, because men like that are not dislodged by single council meetings or a schoolteacher's file of documents. But something had shifted in the town's architecture. The forced choice that everyone had been living with, the choice between community belonging and basic decency toward the Westons, had been exposed as a false one. And once that kind of thing is exposed, it loses much of its power over people who would not have chosen it freely to begin with. Sarah saw this most clearly in small things. In the way Mrs. Alcott, the merchant's wife, stopped and spoke to Eli on the street one afternoon with genuine warmth rather than performed courtesy. In the way Deputy Fitch touched his hat to Aaron when they passed each other without the particular deliberateness of a man performing neutrality. in the way the church congregation rearranged itself slightly on those January Sundays to include rather than exclude the family in the third pew from the front. There was still tension. There were still people who kept their distance. The hidden motive of Harlan Briggs was still fully operational, only more carefully concealed. But the isolation had cracked, and through the cracks, ordinary human decency was beginning to grow back, the way grass grows through cement given enough time and enough sun. On a Sunday afternoon in late January, Aaron and Sarah walked along the frozen creek while Eli threw rocks at the ice, and Thomas walked behind them with a stick, calculating the angles of the ice fracture lines and muttering to himself. The sky was the pale blue of deep cold, and the cottonwoods were bare and silver, and the world had the stripped, honest quality that winter gives to things. Aaron said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know that I am asking because I mean it, not because I think it's what you expect or what's proper." "Ask," Sarah said. "Will you marry me?" He stopped walking and turned to look at her, and his face had that quality of absolute openness she had first seen in the ranch yard in October, the face without armor. "Not because of Briggs or the town or what's practical. Because I love you and I want to be your husband and I want my boys to have you as their mother, and I want more years with you than I can count right now." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the advertisement she had answered in Abilene, about the trunk she had packed, about the stages of a journey that had brought her, by a logic she could not have predicted, to this frozen creek in the Texas Panhandle. "Yes," she said. "Because I love you and want to be your wife, and I already think of those boys as mine, which I suspect they will find either gratifying or annoying depending on the day." Eli, from 20 feet away, said loudly, "I heard that," which confirmed that he had been listening rather than throwing rocks at the ice. Thomas walked up beside her and put his small hand in hers without saying anything, and that was its own kind of answer. They were married in the spring, in March of 1883, when the Texas land was starting to warm and the creek had thawed, and the cottonwoods were putting out their first cautious leaves. The ceremony was in the church that had rearranged its pews slightly to include them, performed by the Methodist minister, who had been quietly observing the events of the fall and winter with careful attention, and had arrived at his own conclusions. Bet Caldwell made the cake, a labor of love that involved 6 eggs and 3 hours and the best dried fruit she had, and it was the finest thing Sarah had eaten since leaving Abilene. Pedro Martinez attended in a suit that was elderly but scrupulously maintained, and wept openly during the ceremony, which he denied immediately afterward with the vehemence of a man protecting his dignity. 11 of Sarah's 12 students were there, which meant 11 sets of parents had brought them, and the schoolroom had been decorated by the children that morning with paper flowers made from old primers, and a banner that said "Congratulations, Miss Harper and Mr. Weston," in 12 different handwriting styles. Eli was the one who had organized the banner, which meant Thomas had been consulted on the spelling, and Eli had managed the logistics, and at least 3 of the younger children had been crying with the effort of getting their letters right, which Eli had handled with the patient exasperation of someone who was going to be a very effective foreman someday. Harlan Briggs was not at the wedding. He had sent no correspondence. His lawyer had sent, 2 weeks prior, a final formal letter regarding the estate, which Aaron's newly retained lawyer in Amarillo, a man named Garfield Torres, who had made a career out of cases exactly like this one, had answered with the comprehensive legal confidence of a man who had read the same judge's notes Sarah had produced in October, and had found in them the foundation for a very solid position. The Weston land was secure, the will was sound, and Aaron Weston was now, legally and publicly, and in the sight of Redemption Creek's entire community, a man with a wife and a lawyer, and a set of neighbors who had, over the winter, quietly and incrementally chosen his side. The summer of 1883 was a good one. The grass came in strong after the hard winter and the cattle were fat by July, and the creek ran high and clear through the Weston land's northern edge. And Sarah taught school 5 days a week, and rode out to the ranch on Fridays and spent the weekend there, and sometimes did not go back to town until Monday morning because there was no reason to. And Redemption Creek. Observing this arrangement with the pragmatic acceptance of a frontier community that had larger concerns than the precise domestic arrangements of its schoolteacher, did not particularly object. She discovered, over the course of that summer, the full dimensions of the life she had entered. She learned the rhythms of a working cattle ranch with the eager attention she brought to everything she did not already know. She learned from Pedro Martinez, whose English was better than his dignified silence sometimes suggested, the particular science of cattle health and the management of grassland. And she learned from Aaron the deeper knowledge of land and weather that comes only from years of watching the same sky over the same ground and understanding what the two say to each other. She learned Eli's particular genius for logistics and Thomas's profound, quiet interior life, and the distinct ecosystem that the three of them had developed over 2 years of managing alone, which had its own customs and rhythms and private language that she did not try to break apart but simply added herself to. The way a river adds a tributary without ceasing to be itself. She also discovered, late in July, that she was pregnant. She told Aaron on a Friday evening in the ranch kitchen, with the smell of the supper she had just cooked still in the air, and the boys asleep in the back, and the lamplight making everything golden and close. She told him plainly and directly, as she did everything, and she watched his face go through surprise, and then a joy so unguarded and enormous that she laughed, partly with happiness and partly with the slight astonishment of seeing a man who kept so much of himself interior suddenly become entirely visible. He came around the table and picked her up out of her chair, which was not something she had ever had done to her before and which turned out to be something she strongly approved of, and he held her and said into her hair, "A baby, Sarah, a baby." "I am aware," she said, laughing. "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I feel entirely fine." "You should sit down." "I am sitting down." "You're holding me." He sat back down but kept her hands and looked at her with that enormous open joy still on his face, and she thought, with the deep, full certainty of someone who has arrived somewhere they did not know they were looking for, that this was it. This was the life that had been waiting at the end of all the other lives she had lived. They told the boys the next morning at breakfast, and Eli's immediate response was, "Is it a boy?" Which Thomas immediately complicated by pointing out that the probabilities were approximately equal, which led to a breakfast table discussion of probability that was so thoroughly Thomas in its progression that Sarah had to hide her face behind her coffee cup to prevent Eli from seeing her laugh. It was a boy. Born in March of 1884, 1 year to the month after the wedding. A healthy, loud, furiously alive boy with Aaron's dark eyes and Sarah's determined jaw, whom they named James Pedro Weston, with the middle name being Pedro Martinez's idea and Aaron's execution. And Pedro's reaction to the news of the name was to leave the room immediately and return 5 minutes later with red eyes, and claim that the wind was unusually strong. Eli took his responsibility as older brother to the new baby, with a seriousness that suggested he had been practicing for a supervisory role his entire life. Thomas, who had always done his most important communicating through action rather than words, could be found holding the baby with a focus and care that went beyond what was strictly required, and that made Sarah watch him sometimes with a fullness in her chest that she could not have articulated. Redemption Creek continued to be the complicated, imperfect, slowly improving place it was. Harlan Briggs retained his bank and his north pasture and his position in the county's commercial life, but his campaign against the Weston family had run into the basic human reality that sustained exclusion requires sustained effort, and people will not indefinitely sustain effort for someone else's property ambitions. By the following year, He had largely redirected his considerable energies toward a dispute with a neighboring rancher that occupied him entirely, and left the Westons in peace. The school grew. 2 new families came to Redemption Creek in the spring of 1884. Homesteaders from Missouri with children who arrived at the schoolroom door clutching each other's hands with the wide-eyed wariness of children in an unfamiliar place. And Sarah greeted them with the welcome she had been practicing since the day she sat in the dirt outside the livery, which was the welcome of someone who understood what it meant to arrive somewhere new and uncertain, and find a person who met your eyes and asked your name. She remained the schoolteacher after James was born, which required some arrangement and some community negotiation, and some firmly expressed positions about the capacity of women to do more than one thing at once. Bet Caldwell, who had decided she loved Sarah with the fierce, practical loyalty of a woman who recognizes a kindred spirit, helped arrange for a neighbor's daughter to watch James during school hours, and the arrangement worked. By the summer of 1885, James was a toddler with Aaron's walk and Sarah's verbal confidence, and an absolute conviction that any room he entered was a room that had been waiting for him, which was either a personality trait or the consequence of having 2 devoted older brothers and 2 parents who found him endlessly remarkable, depending on your philosophical position. Eli, 13 now, had grown tall and serious in the way that boys do when they are growing into the shape of the men they will become, and Thomas, 11, had begun teaching himself algebra from a textbook Sarah had ordered from a bookseller in Dallas, and his progress through it was approximately twice what she had expected. Aaron built an addition onto the ranch house that autumn, a larger kitchen because there were more people at the table now, and a proper study with a built-in bookshelf for the books that had been stacked in the living room for years. He built it with the same methodical, unhurried care with which he did everything, measuring twice and cutting once and checking his work at every stage. And Sarah watched him do it from the kitchen window in the mornings, and thought that she had never seen anyone so perfectly matched to the life they were living. She told him this one evening in October, sitting on the porch steps in the cooling air with the stars coming out and the sounds of the boys inside doing homework. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "I thought about leaving, after Marguerite died. I thought about selling the land, taking the boys somewhere else, starting over where no one knew us." He paused. "Pedro talked me out of it. He said that running from a place means carrying it with you, and that sometimes the only way to change what a place means is to stay and change it." "Pedro is wise," Sarah said. "He told me you were trouble from the moment you sat down in the street," Aaron said, and the warmth in his voice when he said it made trouble sound like the most beautiful word in the English language. "He told me," Sarah said, "the second time I came to the ranch, that you had been a different man before Marguerite died and then a different man again after, and that what he was hoping for was the 3rd version. Did he say what the 3rd version was?" "He said he'd know it when he saw it." She leaned against his shoulder. "I think he's seen it." Aaron put his arm around her, and they sat there in the October evening with the stars opening up above the Texas plain, and the lamplight warm in the windows, and James's indignant voice carrying from inside, where he was apparently disputing some element of bedtime with whichever brother had the misfortune of being responsible for enforcing it. "Sarah," Aaron said. "Aaron," she replied, "I want you to know something." He spoke quietly, with the deliberateness of a man who chooses his words carefully because he knows that words matter. "These 2 years, you coming here and sitting down in the dirt and refusing to be moved by anything Briggs tried and loving my boys and loving me." He stopped. "It's been the greatest gift of my life. I need you to know that." She sat with that for a moment with the fullness of it, and then she said, "I answered an advertisement for a schoolteacher in a town I'd never heard of because I needed to be somewhere I could be useful. I did not expect this." She looked at the lamplight in the windows. "I am very, very glad I sat down in the dirt." He kissed her temple and she closed her eyes, and the night settled around them, large and quiet and full of stars. The following spring brought news. Garfield Torres, the Amarillo lawyer, wrote to say that a land survey commissioned by the county had formally confirmed the boundaries of the Weston property, including the creek access, and that the survey had been entered into the county record with the full legal force of the court's endorsement. This was, in practical terms, the final closing of the trap that Harlan Briggs had spent years constructing. Without a credible legal path to the land, and without a community willing to maintain the social pressure required to make Aaron's life untenable, there was nothing left of his campaign but his own frustration. Aaron read the letter at the breakfast table and set it down and looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at Eli and Thomas and Sarah and he said, "It's over." Eli, who understood the significance, said, "Good," with the crisp finality of someone filing a matter away. Thomas said, "What's for breakfast?" Sarah put scrambled eggs in front of him and said, "Eggs," and Thomas said, "I know," and Eli said, "He always does that," and James, 18 months old in his high chair, said something that was not yet a word but carried the unmistakable tone of someone who wished to be included in the conversation. Life settled into itself. Not the flat, eventless settling that feels like loss, but the deep, rooted settling that feels like arrival. The kind of life that has texture and weight, and the recurring small pleasures of people who know each other well enough to be interested rather than merely familiar. Sarah and Aaron had another child in 1886, a girl this time, born in June when the Texas land was at its most extravagant, and they named her Clara Ruth Weston, the first name for Sarah's sister in Denver, and the middle name because Ruth had been Aaron's mother's name, and because it seemed right to carry forward the women who had made them who they were. Eli was 14 when Clara was born and already working the ranch alongside Aaron with the competence of someone 2 years older, and he greeted his sister with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a boy who had expected to be able to manage this feeling the way he managed everything else, and was discovering that small sisters were not particularly manageable. Thomas, 12, sat beside Sarah's bed the afternoon after the birth and looked at Clara with the same focused attention he brought to mathematical problems, working something out. Then he said, "She has your eyes." "Does she?" Sarah had been unable to look at her daughter without a feeling too large to properly contain. "Your shade of brown," Thomas said. "Not father's, yours." It was, from Thomas, a considerable gift. Pedro Martinez retired from active ranch work the following year, at 70 years old, with the dignified ceremony of a man who had spent his life serving things he believed in and was now ready to be served himself. Aaron built him a small house at the edge of the property, which Pedro inspected with the critical eye of a man who had opinions about construction, and declared satisfactory, and he lived there for another 14 years, dying at 84 with the particular peaceable quality of a person who has no unfinished business. The school in Redemption Creek grew from 1 room to 2 in 1887, which required a second teacher, and Sarah supervised the hiring process with the focused attention she had applied to every challenge in this town since arriving, selecting a young man from San Antonio named Henry Bell, who had a patient disposition and a genuine love of history, and who in due time fell in love with and married Bet Caldwell's niece, which delighted Bet to a degree she expressed by making 3 times the normal amount of food for every subsequent gathering for approximately a year. By 1890, Redemption Creek was a different town than the one Sarah had stepped off the stagecoach into 8 years before. Not fundamentally transformed, because towns do not transform fundamentally in 8 years, but grown into something more honest. The hidden architecture of fear and debt that Harlan Briggs had maintained was not destroyed, but it was visible, and visible things have less power over free people than invisible ones do. The injustice that had been done to Aaron and his boys was not publicly acknowledged, because frontier justice was not generally in the habit of formal acknowledgement, but it was remembered, and memory has its own kind of accountability. Eli Weston, 18 in 1891, began taking on more formal responsibility for the ranch operations, with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been preparing for exactly this role since he was 9 years old, and decided that being competent was the best possible response to a world that kept trying to make you feel small. He had Aaron's directness and Sarah's pragmatism, and a talent for reading weather that Pedro had taught him over years of patient instruction. And he was, everyone who knew anything about it agreed, going to run the finest cattle operation in the Texas Panhandle within 10 years. Thomas, 16, had long since outgrown everything the Redemption Creek School could offer him in mathematics, and Sarah had been writing letters for 2 years to a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, who had been corresponding with Thomas directly since he was 13, and who had, in the spring of 1891, offered him a place in the university's mathematics program on the basis of a collection of proofs Thomas had sent him that the professor described as displaying a quality of original thought that would be exceptional in a graduate student and is, in a boy of 15, simply astonishing. The conversation at the kitchen table when Aaron and Sarah told Thomas about the offer was one Sarah would keep with her for the rest of her life. Thomas had read the letter twice, very carefully, and then looked up and said, "It's far." 350 miles, Aaron said. "I would have to leave," Thomas said. "You would," Sarah agreed. Thomas looked at his hands on the table, and then at Aaron, and then at Sarah, with those grave, watchful eyes that had watched her from the shadow of the livery stable on an August afternoon 9 years ago when the whole shape of her life had been about to change. "I'll go," he said, "but I'll come back." "You will always come back," Sarah said. "This is your home." He left in the fall, with a trunk and a new suit and a set of mathematical notebooks and Aaron's careful, controlled expression at the train platform that meant he was managing something large and keeping it interior, and Sarah's complete composure that lasted until the train was out of sight, and then became a different thing entirely, which Aaron witnessed and held her through without trying to reason her out of it, which was one of the approximately 1,000 things she loved about him. The house was quieter without Thomas, in the particular quality of quiet that specific people leave behind them when they go. James, 7 years old, claimed Thomas's old room for a workshop of sorts, filling it with rocks he was cataloging and pieces of equipment he was inventing, which bore a startling resemblance to the way Thomas had arranged his own mental space, suggesting that 7 years of observation had left more of an impression than anyone had realized. Clara, 4, asked for Thomas every morning for 3 weeks, and then transferred this loyalty to a small dog of uncertain provenance that appeared at the ranch gate one morning, and was admitted by the expedient of James, feeding it something and Eli failing to turn it away firmly enough. Sarah taught at the school in Redemption Creek until 1895, 13 years in total, and in those years she taught reading and arithmetic and the honest, complicated history of Texas to approximately 140 children, several of whom went on to do things she was deeply proud of, including one young woman named Annette Flores, who became the first female teacher certified in Ochiltree County, and wrote Sarah a letter about it that Sarah kept pressed between the pages of her dictionary. When she finally stepped back from the school at 40 years old, it was not because she was tired of it, but because the ranch needed her in a different way, because Eli was now running the cattle operation, and Aaron was building a second enterprise, a horse breeding program that required a degree of organizational management that benefited from her particular skill set, and because James at 11 required a quality of intellectual engagement that the Redemption Creek School had, through no fault of its own, reached the limits of. They sent James to Amarillo the following year to board with Aaron's cousin and attend the academy there, which was a decision arrived at after the most extensive kitchen table debate the Weston household had ever conducted, lasting 3 evenings, with every member of the family, including Eli and Clara, contributing arguments at volume. James went to Amarillo and learned physics and natural history, and came back for holidays with a portable telescope he had constructed himself, and an energy that filled every room he entered so completely that Clara followed him room to room for the first 2 days simply to remain in his vicinity. Thomas came back from Austin in the summers, and in the summer of 1893 he brought with him a young woman named Frances Okonkwo, the daughter of a physician from Houston whose family had made their way to Texas from Nigeria in the preceding generation, a woman of extraordinary precision and warmth who could keep pace with Thomas's mathematical thinking in a way that, as Thomas noted with the understatement that characterized his deepest feelings, he found extremely valuable. She had a doctorate in natural philosophy and the particular quality of stillness that Sarah recognized, looking at Thomas across the table, as the shape of the person he had been looking for all his life. Aaron, watching this across the dinner table on Thomas's first evening home, caught Sarah's eye and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The thing between them was its own complete communication. Sarah and Aaron sat on the porch that evening after everyone was inside, in the October air that had the quality of all the October airs they had shared in 12 years, dense with the smell of dried grass in the cooling day. "Thomas is in love," Sarah said. "He is," Aaron agreed. "Frances is remarkable." "She is." Sarah looked at the sky. "Do you remember when Eli came out from behind that mesquite bush?" Aaron made a sound that was the closest he got to laughing out loud, which was a rich, quiet vibration somewhere in his chest. "I remember." "Thomas had apparently known before Eli asked," she said. "He told me years later. He said he knew the first day you brought me the cornbread." Aaron looked at her with the eyes that were still, after 12 years of knowing them, capable of making her feel as seen as anyone had ever been. "He was more perceptive than I was," he said. "I was still arguing with myself about it." "You argued very inefficiently," she said. "I was also a man with, as I believe I mentioned, considerable difficulties attached." "You were," she agreed. "And I was a woman who had spent 8 years being necessary to everyone else, and had just discovered that being necessary to herself meant being willing to sit down in the dirt." "Thank God for that," he said. He took her hand, as he had been in the habit of doing for 12 years, not dramatically but with the completeness of a man who intends the gesture, and they sat together in the cooling evening, with the lamp-warm windows behind them and the children's voices inside, and the enormous Texas sky overhead, and the life they had made between them was real and solid and full. The way things are when they have been built with care and courage, and the willingness to keep sitting down in the dirt, until something worth standing up for reveals itself. Thomas and Frances were married the following spring at the Weston Ranch, in the yard under the cottonwood trees that were just coming into leaf, with the creek audible in the distance, and the whole Weston family around them, and a number of guests from Austin, who found the Texas Panhandle both larger and more astonishing than they had expected. Pedro Martinez attended in his elderly suit and wept openly, which he denied less strenuously than he used to, age having made certain things seem less worth defending. Bet Caldwell attended and ate 3 pieces of cake and declared them proof of a just universe. Eli danced with Clara, who was 9 and had decided dancing was an appropriate use of her time, and they moved through the yard with the particular unself-consciousness of people who have been teasing each other since childhood and have arrived, without noticing, at genuine affection. James, 12, spent the entirety of the reception discussing the thermodynamics of cooking with Frances's father, who was a man of broad scientific interest, and who later wrote to Sarah that her youngest son was the most exhaustingly intelligent person he had ever met, which was high praise from a physician. Aaron found Sarah in a quiet moment beside the house, away from the celebration, and stopped beside her, and they looked at the yard together, at the people they loved gathered in the afternoon light. "Is it what you imagined," he asked, "when you answered that advertisement in Abilene?" She considered this honestly, as she considered everything. "I imagined being useful," she said. "I imagined a schoolroom and children who needed teaching and a place to put my energy into something that mattered. And I got all of that," she said, "and also you, which was not in the advertisement." "An oversight on the council's part," he said gravely. "A catastrophic oversight," she agreed. "I intend to hold them responsible." He put his arm around her in the shade of the house, while their son Thomas danced with his new wife in the yard, and their daughter Clara supervised the dancing with critical precision, and their son James argued physics with a physician, and Eli stood at the edge of the yard with Pedro, the two of them looking out at the ranch land in the companionable silence of people who understand a thing together without needing to say it. 12 years from the day she had stepped off a stagecoach into a dust-caked August afternoon in Redemption Creek, Sarah Harper Weston stood in the shade of her own home with her husband's arm around her and knew, with absolute, unshakable certainty, that the truest and most important thing she had ever done was sit down in the dirt and ask two small boys their names. Everything else had followed from that. The love, the marriage, the children, the life that had grown up around a foundation laid in one quiet, deliberate act of refusal to walk past what needed stopping. Every difficulty had been real. Every obstacle had required something of her. But none of it had been, in the end, beyond the reach of a woman who understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else mattered more. She leaned into Aaron's shoulder, and he pressed his lips to her hair, and around them the celebration continued in the warm spring light, and Redemption Creek lay beyond the ranch's borders, imperfect and real and considerably less hostile than it had once been, and the creek ran through the northern boundary of the Weston land with the patient constancy of water that has always known where it belongs. It was enough. It was, in truth, everything.